Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings, all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 17 of my series on the myth of authority. Today, we continue our discussion about the transition to a free society. Let me recap the recent episodes so today's discussion is put into context. And be sure to listen to them all to get the full details, which I've linked to. The main theme of the discussion about the transition to a free society is this: the myth of political authority, which is the belief that people in government have moral authority over the rest of us. That myth's status gives us a good measuring stick to gauge how far along we are in the transition. In the old days, the myth was nice and solid. The people's belief in the myth was demonstrated outwardly in their actions. They made clear their willingness to be dominated by rulers. All this describes a hospitable environment, a welcome environment for the people who want to dominate others. In this environment, the bullies of government could thrive. So, no shock, we had solid statism. And even today, at the very beginning of the transition, the myth is still quite solid. Most people continue to act on the myth of authority by showing they are okay with having political rulers. The environment, therefore, remains quite attractive to the bullies. And so, we continue to have an entrenched state. But here's the difference today. The myth is showing signs of erosion, and as a result, people's actions reflect this. And that changes the environment the bullies operate in. It's less welcoming. The bullies have to deal with that shifting environment. We've covered the current stage of the transition, both from the point of view of the myth and the bullies of government. Then we started to speculate about the next stages, the coming decades. And that analysis is comprised of the same two factors, the myth itself and the bullies. So last time, we focused on the myth during the next stages. I explained from a broad perspective why the majority is quite likely to go along with that trend of greater skepticism of the state. Now today, we'll drill into more detail about the myth in the coming decades. More reasons we'll see an acceleration of skepticism of the state, and we'll cover how the eroding myth translates into people's behavior, their actions. So, why should the erosion of the myth accelerate? It's pretty obvious when we break the population down by age group. Start with today's typical older person, the baby boomers. They grew up solidly with the myth of authority. They learned to pay attention to politics, not just voting, but keeping up with current events as we were taught in school to do, remember? Just like their own parents, politics was the center topic pretty darned often. The myth of authority made sure politics was a very important part of life. Then we have today's younger adults. The typical young adult believes the myth of authority too, of course, but they generally only have a passing interest in politics. Nothing dramatic, not really involved beyond voting, and even that's a maybe. They pay some attention to the news, to politics, to the culture, but they're not obsessed. They talk politics with others a bit, but not constantly. They have quite a few other interests like family, sports, social media, etc., and all that competes for their attention. Again, I'm talking about the typical, common young adult. Last, we have today's children. And also true, they too are growing up in a world that still pushes the myth of authority, but they're not getting it quite as drilled in as their elders did. There's greater skepticism of the state today, and that's the environment in which today's children are growing up. And one of their key influences is their parents, those young adults I mentioned just now. Proportionally fewer of them today are vested in politics, so that's a nice assist for today's children, having parents who are not setting as strong an example of focusing on politics. Okay, so that's today's world. Now let's examine those same age groups a decade or two from now. By looking at the three groups, we'll easily see why the future skepticism of government should be far greater than it is today. First, the older crowd. Sorry, but there will simply be fewer of them left. Significantly fewer around anymore, from the generations who grew up utterly enthralled by the myth of authority. Put simply, the people in the population least skeptical of the myth will be dying off, and the few left will have very diminished influence. Second, today's young adults will be near or at middle age. They will have become the most influential group. They matured during today's period of growing skepticism of the state. They will carry that skepticism forward and make it even more mainstream. And to be clear, not from any significant activism. They'll simply carry forward the environment they grew up in. And finally, today's children will be the young adults. They have the least indoctrination into the myth compared to everyone else. So it's highly plausible their generation will have the least attachment to government ever. So overall, a few decades from now, we'll see a greater percentage living in an even more skeptical environment. Okay, now for the meat of the episode. How will this translate into human behaviors? I'm going to sort of rank these on a scale. We'll start with the most passive forms of behavior and proceed to more active behaviors. I'm starting with passive behaviors because this parallels with the majority. Most tend to passively follow the trends. So first off, the most passive behavior is what I call quiet indifference. Decades ahead, there'll be the same things as today that we have to deal with in life: earning a living, raising families, pursuing interests, etc. This aspect of people's environment is nothing new. It's the realities of life. But in that mix will be a diminishing relevance of government. Technology and choices will further crowd out the government. That's already evident. But added to that will be that greater skepticism. So in the ranking of things that are important in people's lives, the state's importance will slip down the scale. Down it drops on the list of things needing their attention. I love this white pill, even though it doesn't have the same in-your-face quality. Statism will lose ground largely because of the people's quiet indifference to it. It's not even that they will be rejecting politics. They'll be ignoring it. Again, not 100%, but more than today. Today's children and young adults, as they grow up, will have experienced politics as a laughable or distracting side issue. A decade or two from now, as busier people with lots on their plate, a greater number will simply have no time or need for politics. In practice, what does this indifference look like? They'll have less interest in getting involved politically. Voting percentages should shrink. When they have to comply with government laws, for example, paying taxes, licensing, etc., sure, they'll go along, but not from a feeling of moral obedience. It'll be from the indifference of dealing with one of life's built-in annoyances. What else? They will not as much pass along the indoctrination, not as much talk about politics around their kids or at work and so on. Again, I'm not saying this sort of thing will cease altogether. I am saying it will be less in the environment than today. More people will basically hand-wave away the subject of government, seeing it as irrelevant, a waste of time. In other words, being indifferent. That leads to the next level up from quiet indifference. It's when expressions are not so quiet. I call this verbal dissatisfaction. This is where people actually feel like saying what they think, saying that they don't care for paying taxes, saying the government messes up or can't be trusted or shouldn't be around at all. Verbal dissatisfaction comes out in the way people converse or write or podcast or post to social media. All of it expresses a sense of discontentment in the air, mistrust, skepticism. And by the way, it's a short road from verbal dissatisfaction to outright mocking the state. And it bears repeating. We see all this today. A decade or so from now, it will be seen even more frequently and broadly. Okay, what's the next level from verbal dissatisfaction? Well, it's what I call quiet disregard, getting around the government, but quietly. It's not too much about taking specific actions. It's mostly refraining from complying with whatever rules or requirements the government puts in the way, at least the kinds where they can get away with it. You can think of dozens of examples easily, like when a person's preparing a tax return and deducting charitable donations. If they exaggerate the donations, but they're plausible, they can get a break on their taxes. They're quietly disregarding the tax rules that expect them to report accurately. A driver on the freeway might quietly disregard the speed limit and go a bit over it, especially if everyone else is doing it. Chances are slim he'll get ticketed. Quiet disregard. A business owner may fudge business expenses, but do it enough under thresholds that it's not likely to get caught. He may find ways to dance around other business regulations in a similar way, plausibly and quietly. A person working from home can deduct some of their home expenses, but this is often subjective, so they might deduct higher but plausible amounts. Same for business supplies or car mileage. Once again, none of this is new. They are trends that would have every reason to continue in the coming decades, especially in the age groups I mentioned. And keep in mind along the way how it reflects the erosion of the myth of authority. In the past, people more often complied with government rules out of a sense of moral obligation because they were under the spell of the myth. But look at these examples of quiet disregard. People do not feel guilty about them. Their compliance, say with tax laws, are from fear of the consequences, not from moral obligation. That's the erosion of the myth, and that's why non-compliance is more likely. It's erosion of willing self-compliance. What would you say the next level is from quiet disregard? Probably not so quiet disregard. Let's call it outright defiance. Now, a quick pause here. Remember I said I was listing these on a scale. As we go through these behaviors, it should be clear that the numbers decline as we go. At first, we had quiet indifference. You can imagine a very large number would express themselves this way. Also a lot, though maybe a bit fewer, would show the next level, verbal dissatisfaction. And a lot would act with quiet disregard, but probably fewer still. So now when we get to outright defiance, it should be obvious even fewer would do this. But I don't want to lose the principle that in the coming decades, today's trends will give us more in all these groups compared with today. That's what counts in the transition. So, on to outright defiance. People will find even more ways to circumvent laws and regulations, or even refusing at all to comply. If this sounds difficult to believe, refer to my previous episode discussing how COVID played out. There was outright defiance of so many of those mandates. I might add, even a lot of actual sheriffs and their staff were refusing to obey state or federal level rules. There's a double whammy white pill from outright defiance. For one, it's nice, clear evidence the myth of authority is breaking down, but also recall that huge lesson of a previous episode, how when people see something work in practice, like defying the state, it shows them that something they thought impossible is indeed possible, that it's even okay to do it since others are doing it, plus a bonus in how it shows people the state is not superhuman, that it actually can be brought down a notch or defeated or even made to back off. It reminds me of, I think, the movie Rocky IV, where the Russian opponent was portrayed as invincible. The moment in the ring when Rocky landed his first good shot and drew the guy's blood, it cleared the false image of the guy as a machine. It's just like that red pill moment when you realize the state is just people, actually just bullies. That's why decades from now, acts of defiance will by themselves help to red pill people. Then there's taxes. Here we can foresee even more outright defiance. Some people will get up the nerve to pay less taxes or not pay at all. Businesses disregarding payroll tax deductions or other taxes and regulations too. I'll explain next time when we cover the bully's perspective why this example is particularly plausible. Now, at this point, it's worth discussing briefly behaviors that extend beyond what we've covered, namely confrontational defiance, arguing with law enforcement, or beyond that, the willingness to use force to defy the state. Well, standing one's ground to law enforcement, especially if it's within one's so-called rights, already happens, as my previous episode's examples showed. Problem is, they have the gun. So it's risky now, and as long as they have the guns, it will always come with risk. People take that risk at their own peril. But in any case, most people are not likely to do it. But then there's the willingness to use actual force against the state. I won't spend much time on this. My focus in this analysis is the general trends toward a free society. This really includes the behaviors we are most likely to see emerging from the general overall population. This makes outlier behaviors, in particular violence, not pertinent to the discussion. As long as violence, hopefully, remains rare, then it's unlikely to impact the general trends, which is why it falls outside the scope of this discussion. Now, a separate type of behavior would be what I call parallel activities. While the state is messing things up over there, parallel activities get things done over here. This would be social arrangements or business activities that essentially just do what the state can't seem to get right. So it's ignoring the state, plus building something better. Homeschooling would be just one great example of this. Again, we see this today and would expect it to grow with time. And it's another good indicator that the myth is eroding, because people are willing to put their time and money into pursuits that previously were assumed to be government's responsibilities. And let's not forget that libertarian and anarchist thinkers won't be going anywhere during the transition. They'll continue to write, speak, and podcast the liberty message. That scholarly work I've mentioned previously as so foundational to an ultimate free society, that groundwork will be all the more valuable as we move closer to a free society. Also today we see the start of a great trend, libertarians being showcased publicly. This is so valuable as pure plain old advertising. It normalizes the ideas. However, later on, it'll be even more impactful. See, today, when libertarians are showcased, mostly they have a more theoretical message, which is fine, of course. But imagine a decade or so from now, when the outward signs we're predicting here actually start to happen. When the outward signs are obvious, freedom thinkers will be able to better point out success in theory and practice. And finally, what we've all been waiting for. It's very plausible that by the time a few more decades pass, we'll see the first genuine establishment of free communities, territories that are self-declared anarchist enclaves based on private property and non-aggression. Today, there are genuine efforts in that direction, but so far these are mainly foundational. They're exploring, for example, the legal aspects of forming such communities. So at least that work has started. If the other trends we've covered continue, they will have helped establish a favorable environment for the acceptance of those sorts of projects. But now, to be realistic, the real measure of success here would be if they managed to be recognized by at least some major governments. Unfortunately, during the transition, recognition of some governments will probably be necessary, mainly to make sure governments stay off their backs. But regardless of when it happens, once it does, I think we can agree that'll be the beginning of the end of statism. That very same psychology of seeing a real working example will apply big time when it comes to a free community. When people, especially entrepreneurs, see working, profitable examples, the floodgates will open. I'll touch on this more in an upcoming episode when we cover timelines. Okay, let me wrap up all of this. One big takeaway. As the myth erodes, skepticism of the state will increase. This reveals itself in people's behavior. More of the trends we're already seeing. More quiet indifference to the state. More verbal dissatisfaction. More disregard of the state. More parallel institutions forming. More of all of it. Another takeaway, the psychological snowball effect. The average person will be in a new environment. Skepticism, indifference, disregard of the state won't be out of the ordinary anymore. It'll become normalized. What did we learn the majority likes to be? Passive, to be like everyone else. Seeing others do things, people get their cues of what is permitted. Skepticism of the state will be more normal, and normal tends to snowball. And that's also another white pill in all of this. Libertarians have tended to predict disruption or even violence in the transition. On this, they've had it wrong. It's rather this slow, organic, and yes, normal-looking trend. The transition hasn't been dramatic so far, and it should continue that way. An ongoing change in what's normal. And remember this too. Sure, a big thing will be changing, namely the erosion of the myth of authority, and all the outward effects of that will change with it. I'm not minimizing the historical impact of that shift, but folks, all the while, everything else in life, the millions of other aspects of regular life, will all still be there like before. People pursuing their lives, producing goods and services, knowledge and skills, all still there. Infrastructure, still there. Businesses, still there. Manufacturing, capital, farms, all still there. Just like today. It makes this transition we're in not really all that disruptive and certainly nothing to fear. So we of all people should welcome the one thing that is changing. The slow but relentless death of the myth of authority. So that covers the myth in the upcoming stages of the transition and how people's behavior will reflect its erosion. Next time, we'll finally check in on the bullies. Since people's behaviors will change, it'll create quite a different environment compared to before the transition and even compared to today. How the bullies have to deal with this will be a fun ride. Until then, take care and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.